Listen up, because in 1966, Space Ghost wasn't just another superhero cartoon. This show was part of CBS's Saturday morning lineup, pulling over 8 million viewers per episode, featured animation quality that rivaled theatrical shorts, and introduced kids to a spacefaring superhero with actual powers, actual stakes, and actual science fiction concepts beyond just punch the bad guy. The show ran for 2 seasons, with 42 episodes, generated millions in merchandise sales, and created a character design so iconic that it would be revived, parodied, and reimagined for decades. Space Ghost became Hanna-Barbera's first attempt at serious action-adventure animation. But here's the thing, by 1968 it was cancelled, just 2 seasons despite strong ratings and cultural penetration, and it would take 26 years before anyone even thought to bring Space Ghost back. And when they did, they turned him into a talk show host in what became one of the weirdest reboots in television history. But what you probably don't know is the production gamble Hanna-Barbera made by attempting serious action instead of their usual comedy, the network decisions that killed it despite success, and the 3 catastrophic mistakes that prevented Space Ghost from becoming the franchise it should have been. And I've got to warn you, when you see what happened behind the scenes, you're going to realize that Space Ghost was Hanna-Barbera trying to prove they could do more than talking animals, and the industry punished them for daring to be different. So buckle up, because this is about how you create something genuinely innovative in children's television and then watch it get destroyed because nobody knew what to do with it. How Hanna-Barbera tried to get serious. Alright, so here's something most people don't realize. Space Ghost only exists because Hanna-Barbera was tired of being pigeonholed as the funny talking animals studio. From 1957 through 1965, Hanna-Barbera had completely dominated Saturday morning and syndicated animation with one formula: limited animation comedy. Huckleberry Hound, Yogi Bear, The Flintstones, The Jetsons, Top Cat, all comedies, all cost-effective limited animation, all massive successes. But by the mid-1960s, Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera were watching the landscape change. Comic books were getting more serious. The Batman TV show had premiered in 1966 and was a massive hit, with its campy but sincere superhero action. Kids were clearly hungry for heroes and adventure, not just slapstick comedy. And Hanna-Barbera's one attempt at action-adventure, Johnny Quest in 1964, had proven you could make sophisticated animated action for television. Yeah, Johnny Quest had been cancelled after 1 season due to cost and violence concerns, but it had also shown there was an audience for this kind of content. So in 1966, Hanna-Barbera pitched CBS on a superhero show, not a comedy, not a parody, an actual serious science fiction superhero series. They called it Space Ghost. The concept was pure Silver Age comics. A mysterious superhero with a dark costume and energy powers patrols the galaxy, fighting alien threats alongside 2 teenagers and their monkey. He operated from an invisible spaceship called the Phantom Cruiser and faced genuinely bizarre sci-fi villains: Zorak the Space Mantis, Moltar the Lava Man, the Spider Woman, Metalis. CBS greenlit it, but with conditions. It had to be produced on a Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning budget, which meant limited animation. And it had to be paired with other content in a 1-hour block format. Space Ghost segments alternating with other shows to create variety. Hanna-Barbera agreed. They developed Space Ghost as 15-minute segments that would air as part of a larger block. Initially, it was paired with Dino Boy, a primitive Earth adventure segment, and later with the Herculoids, another action-adventure property. The budget was approximately $35,000 per episode, cheap by Johnny Quest standards, $67,000 per episode, but expensive for typical Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning fare, $15,000 to $20,000 per episode for shows like Scooby-Doo later. That extra budget bought noticeably better animation than their comedy shows, more detailed character designs, more elaborate action sequences, more sophisticated backgrounds. Space Ghost wasn't theatrical quality like Johnny Quest, but it was clearly a step above typical Saturday morning animation, and they took the storytelling seriously. No comic relief, no winking at the camera, no breaking the fourth wall. Space Ghost played it straight. serious sci-fi action with genuine stakes. When Space Ghost fought Zorak, it felt dangerous. When villains captured John and Jace, it felt like real peril. The voice casting reflected this seriousness. Gary Owens gave Space Ghost a deep, heroic voice with that distinctive reverb effect.
My only chance is to use all my energy in one blast. It'll either create a super monster.
The villains were genuinely menacing. The dialogue was earnest and dramatic, not campy and jokey. Space Ghost premiered on CBS in September 1966 as part of the Saturday morning lineup, and kids responded immediately. The show was pulling over 8 million viewers per episode by mid-season, strong numbers that put it in the top tier of Saturday morning programming. Merchandise followed. Dell Comics published Space Ghost comic books. Gold Key produced coloring books and activity sets. Ideal Toy Company had plans for action figures. The character was penetrating kid culture successfully. For one season, Space Ghost was a genuine hit. CBS renewed it for season 2. Hanna-Barbera expanded production. Everything looked sustainable, but there were problems lurking beneath the surface. Problems that would kill the show just as it was hitting its stride. Mistake number 1. The limited animation undercut the action. Here's the fundamental problem Space Ghost could never solve. You can't do convincing action-adventure with limited animation. Hanna-Barbera had perfected limited animation for comedy. When Yogi Bear's mouth moves while his body stays still, it's fine because the comedy is in the dialogue and timing. When Fred Flintstone runs with a repeated background cycle, it works because The Flintstones is about character interaction, not movement. But action-adventure requires movement. Fight scenes need dynamic choreography. Chase sequences need speed and fluidity. Energy blasts need impact. Space battles need spectacle. And Space Ghost, for all its ambition, was still limited animation. Characters moved stiffly. Fight scenes relied on still frames with motion lines. Energy blasts were just animated rays overlaid on static poses. The Phantom Cruiser flying through space was obviously the same ship cell sliding across a repeating starfield background. Compare Space Ghost to Johnny Quest, which had fluid, theatrical quality animation, or compare it to contemporary theatrical superhero content like the 1960s Marvel cartoons, which at least attempted dynamic movement through rotoscoping. Space Ghost looked better than typical Hanna-Barbera comedies, but it still looked cheap compared to what action-adventure needed to be compelling, and kids noticed. The show was exciting despite the animation limitations, not because of them. By season 2, the animation quality actually declined. Budget pressures forced even more cost-cutting. More stock footage of Space Ghost's power band firing. More repeated transformation sequences of Jan and Jace getting captured. More static shots with limited movement. The show that was supposed to prove Hanna-Barbera could do serious action was being undermined by the same cost-cutting techniques that worked for their comedies but failed for action. And here's the brutal reality. By 1967, CBS was comparing Space Ghost to other action content. The Batman TV show had explosive fight scenes with OW and BAM graphics and camp energy that felt alive. Space Ghost had stiff characters sliding across backgrounds. The limited animation model that made Hanna-Barbera successful was fundamentally incompatible with the action-adventure genre they were trying to conquer. Mistake number 2, CBS kept changing the format and time slot. This is the decision that killed Space Ghost's momentum. CBS wouldn't leave it alone. Season 1 premiered in September 1966 as part of a 1-hour block with Dino Boy. Space Ghost got 2 15-minute segments per hour. The format worked. Kids knew when to tune in. The ratings were strong. Then CBS decided to tinker with it. For Season 2 in September 1967, CBS reconfigured the show. Now it was Space Ghost and Dino Boy, sharing a half hour with only one 15-minute Space Ghost segment instead of 2. The other half hour went to a different show entirely. Space Ghost was getting half the airtime it had in Season 1. Why? CBS wanted to introduce new properties and thought mixing up the programming blocks would create variety. But what it actually did was confuse the audience. Kids who'd been watching 2 Space Ghost adventures per week were now getting 1. Then mid-season, CBS moved the time slot. Space Ghost went from 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. in some markets, 9 a.m. in others. Different regions got different schedules. There was no consistency, And for the 1968 season, CBS did it again. Space Ghost was now paired with the Herculoids in a different programming block entirely, with the time slot changed yet again. Every time CBS reconfigured the schedule, they lost viewers. Kids couldn't keep track of when Space Ghost was on. Parents didn't know what time to make sure their kids were in front of the TV. The built-in audience from Season 1 was being eroded by constant schedule changes. By mid-1968, ratings had declined not because the show was less popular, but because CBS had made it harder to find and watch. Compare that to shows CBS left alone in consistent time slots. Scooby-Doo, which premiered in 1969, stayed in the same time slot for years and became an institution. Space Ghost was constantly moving around like CBS didn't know what to do with it. The network sabotaged its own show through programming incompetence. Mistake number 3. Hanna-Barbera couldn't commit to action-adventure. Here's what really gets me about Space Ghost's failure. Hanna-Barbera created this action-adventure property. It was successful, and then they immediately went back to making comedies. Space Ghost should have been the foundation of a Hanna-Barbera action universe. They should have doubled down on serious superhero content. They should have created more shows in that vein and built an entire lineup of action properties. Instead, after Space Ghost, what did Hanna-Barbera produce? Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? In 1969, a comedy mystery show. The Perils of Penelope Pitstop, comedy. Wacky Races, comedy. Josie and the Pussycats, comedy. They went right back to their comfort zone. Space Ghost was treated as an experiment, not a template. And here's why that was catastrophic. Space Ghost needed ongoing support and development to succeed. It needed Hanna-Barbera to commit to the action-adventure genre, to learn from what worked and what didn't, to refine their approach and build on the foundation. But Hanna-Barbera saw Space Ghost's challenges, the limited animation problems, the CBS scheduling issues, the higher per-episode costs, and concluded, action-adventure is too hard. Let's go back to what we know. When Space Ghost was canceled in 1968 after just 2 seasons and 42 episodes, Hanna-Barbera didn't fight for it. They didn't pitch a revival. They didn't try to move it to another network. They just let it die and moved on to producing more comedies. The Herculoids, which had been paired with Space Ghost, continued for a while, but was also eventually canceled. Hanna-Barbera wouldn't attempt serious action-adventure again until the 1980s with shows like Thundar the Barbarian. Space Ghost was abandoned because Hanna-Barbera wasn't willing to commit to being an action studio. They were a comedy studio that briefly experimented with action, decided it was too complicated, and retreated to safety. From canceled hero to ironic talk show host, here's where the Space Ghost story gets weird. From 1968 to 1994, Space Ghost essentially disappeared. The original 42 episodes stayed in syndication for a while, then faded into obscurity. Occasional reruns on cable, some comic book attempts, but mostly, Space Ghost was forgotten. Then in 1994, Cartoon Network, which was owned by Turner Broadcasting, which had bought Hanna-Barbera, had an insane idea. What if we took Space Ghost and made him a talk show host? What if we created a deliberately low-budget, absurdist late-night talk show using the Space Ghost character and animation? Space Ghost Coast to Coast premiered and was brilliant. Completely insane, but brilliant. They took the serious superhero character and made him an incompetent, egotistical talk show host, interviewing real celebrities. Zorak became his band leader. Moltar became his director. The whole thing was ironic, self-aware, and hilarious. And it worked. Space Ghost Coast to Coast ran for 11 seasons and became a cult phenomenon. It launched Adult Swim. It influenced modern comedy. It made Space Ghost more famous in the 1990s and 2000s than he'd ever been in the 1960s. But here's the irony. The thing that made the reboot successful was treating the original show as a joke. Space Ghost became famous again by being the opposite of what he was created to be, an ironic comedy instead of serious action-adventure. The original Space Ghost, the serious superhero who fought Zorak and saved the galaxy, is mostly forgotten. The Space Ghost everyone remembers is the talk show host version that mocked the original. That's a weird legacy for a show that tried so hard to be taken seriously, when you're ahead of your time in the wrong way. So here's the thing about Space Ghost. It was trying to do something the industry wasn't ready for. serious action-adventure in limited animation format. Jonny Quest had proven theatrical quality animation could do action-adventure, but at costs Saturday morning couldn't sustain. Space Ghost tried to do action-adventure at Saturday morning costs, and the limited animation couldn't support it. The show was caught between two models, too expensive and serious for typical Hanna-Barbera comedy production, too cheap and limited for genuine action-adventure. It needed either a bigger budget to do action right, or a different genre that worked with limited animation. But it was stuck in this middle ground where it couldn't fully succeed at what it was trying to do. And neither CBS nor Hanna-Barbera was willing to commit to solving that problem. CBS kept tinkering with the format instead of supporting it. Hanna-Barbera retreated to comedy instead of refining their action approach. So that's the rise and fall of Space Ghost, a show that dared to be serious in an era of comedy, that tried to do action-adventure on comedy budgets, and that got killed by network incompetence and studio ambivalence. If you remember watching the original Space Ghost and being genuinely invested in whether he'd defeat Zorak, you're my people. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite Space Ghost villain. Mine was Moltar, obviously, the lava man with the great voice. And if you're not subscribed yet, there's a lot more animation history where this came from.